We want to become better stewards of what God's given us. This is one of the more stressful aspects of people's lives, how they deal with money and resources. And one of the things we talked about a couple weeks ago was we believe God is Jehovah Jireh. We believe he's our provider. And when we have desperate needs and just any needs, we believe God's able to help us and does help us meet those needs. But we have to be responsible with our resources as well. You can't be just do whatever you want with your resources and then always be asking God to bail you out of stuff. So it's about how can we become responsible in our stewardship and how we manage what God has given us. And so what this particular book tries to do is it looks at these different approaches that people have towards money. And just like we have different personalities, we all have different approaches to how we handle our resources. And it's not that one approach is better than the other necessarily. There's some general principles that will apply to all of these different money types, but there are good characteristics in each money type, and then there's some potential pitfalls in each money type. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to look through all of this to see what we can learn about ourselves and to see how we can accentuate the positive characteristics while also trying to, of course, mitigate the negative ones. And so just a recap from last week, there are 7 characters altogether. Last week we talked about Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham's characteristic, or the one word that describes his particular money type, is hospitality, and Isaac is that disciplined approach towards money. Tonight we're going to talk about, with the help of the Lord, Jacob and Joseph. Before we get there, though, just to review a little bit from last week, for an Abraham type, the folks that are given to hospitality, these are folks that like to give, and they feel like money is best used when it's used to make others feel valued and special. So we talked about some of the good characteristics of an Abraham type include that these are folks that tend to exceed expectations. They go above and beyond and tend to be extravagant even in their giving. They like to put others first. They find great fulfillment in giving. It's not a drudgery to them. They like to plan the parties. They like to host the events. They like to do for others. And they like to use their resources in ways that oftentimes go unnoticed. They don't mind being behind the scenes with what they do. The potential negative side, or what Brown in the book calls the shadow side of an Abraham type, though, is that they have a tendency, if they're not careful, to become too self-sufficient. They have a hard time accepting help or generosity from others. They give it in spades, but they have a hard time receiving generosity. And if left unchecked, we talked about their attitude of giving can become a source of pride. They might even develop feelings of superiority, where they feel like they are better than the person who they are blessing. And so we have to be careful with that if you are an Abraham type. The second type we looked at last week were the Isaac types. These are the folks that are very disciplined with their money. They believe that every dollar they have and earn should be maximized to its fullest potential. These are folks who see potential in everything, and they can turn trash into treasure because they always see the potential for restoration in things. These are persistent people. They're willing to stick at it and grind things out and work hard, and they are people that are willing to also show restraint. They like having a budget. They like living within their means. They're willing to say no even to themselves if whatever their desires are would overextend them financially. The shadow side, the potential pitfalls of an Isaac type, though, is that they can sometimes struggle and battle with fear. A lot of their discipline may come from a fear of being without. It's a self-preservation kind of thing. And in that vein, they may put too much trust in themselves as opposed to trusting God for their provision. They might become the workaholics among us. These are the folks that might become too rigid in their discipline. The boundaries and the restraints that they show is good, but when taken to an extreme, their rules become the goal instead of being just a mechanism to help get people to better goals. So that ties into the last potential pitfall of an Isaac type, which is the fact that these are folks who might have a hard time stopping to enjoy what they have. There's nothing wrong with stopping to enjoy life a little bit. Obviously, as long as you do so within your means and as long as you do so in a way that doesn't violate your walk with God. But Isaac types just need to be reminded of that from time to time. So that's a quick recap of what we talked about last week. So tonight, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about Jacob and Joseph. And so Jacob, his money type is characterized by beauty. Jacob is characterized by beauty. So let's explain that a little bit. Last week when we discussed Isaac, we made mention of that scene where Jacob and his mom trick Isaac into giving Jacob the blessing of the father when it was supposed to go to Esau. And when Esau came home and figured out what happened, he literally wanted to kill his brother Isaac. So Jacob takes off and runs for his life. When you continue to follow Jacob's story, though, he has an encounter with God while he's out there running for his life. And then as his travels continue, he winds up meeting his uncle, a man by the name of Laban. And he goes home with Laban and he begins to work for him. About a month goes by and Laban understands that he should not expect Jacob to work for him for nothing. So he asks Jacob what he wants for his wages. And the Bible says that Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was beautiful and well-favored. And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, thy younger daughter. Jacob had fallen in love with the beauty of Rachel. So when Laban asked him what he wanted for wages, Jacob chose to use his resources to go after that beauty. He wanted to have the honor of marrying Laban's youngest daughter if he would stay and work for her for 7 years. So the story famously goes that Jacob did stay those 7 years and worked, and afterwards there was a wedding planned. Jacob married Laban's daughter, but some combination of veiling and poor lighting and maybe some excessive celebration led to Jacob realizing that the young lady in bed with him the day after the wedding wasn't Rachel. It was her older sister, Leah. Laban had tricked Jacob into marrying the older daughter first because in Laban's eyes it would not have been right to marry off the younger sister before Leah. But it wasn't Leah that Jacob was in love with. It was Rachel. It was the beauty of Rachel that he fell for. And he was so in love with her that Jacob agreed to work an additional 7 years so that he could marry the woman whose beauty had captured his heart. So for a Jacob type, they believe that money should be used on pleasurable experiences. Brown says in the book, and I'm quoting, more than any other, a Jacob type's soul yearns for the object of its affection, whether it's a physical item or experience. Jacob types do not first ask, how much does this cost, or how much use can I get out of this compared to the price, like an Isaac type would. Jacobs initially think, this is amazing, I want it, and then they devise a plan to proceed, seeking the best deal in the process. He says, desire comes first, and then desire draws on discipline to acquire the object or experience, end quote. So one of the core characteristics of a Jacob type is that Jacobs are able to see beauty in things even if it lies beneath the surface. You know, when Jacob had that encounter with God, and we mentioned it briefly before he met Laban, he was sleeping on a rock out in the middle of nowhere, and he had this vision of angels ascending and descending on a ladder. And when he woke up, he wanted to commemorate the experience. So he took some oil, some resources. He poured it over that rock that was being used for his pillow because he wanted to have something to remember that moment by. To anybody else, it would have just been a rock out in the middle of nowhere. But to Jacob, there was something beautiful that happened there, so he was willing to use his resources to remember that. Some people are almost willing to make money no object to them when they see something that they want because it has significance or meaning to them. It could be an antique that reminds them of something from their childhood, or maybe it's some family heirloom that they've stumbled across and now they have become obsessed with getting it restored or something to that effect. That is a Jacob type on display. Another characteristic of a Jacob type is that they tend to have a blend of both generosity and disciplined restraint. They essentially then have a little bit of the Abraham type and the Isaac type that we talked about last week. If you think about it, for Jacob, the generosity with which he was willing to expend his resources to work for nearly a decade just to have the honor of marrying Rachel, that is the kind of generosity that would come from an Abraham type. But it also took the discipline and the restraint of an Isaac type for Jacob to stick with it and grind it out for 7 years and then do it for an additional 7 years after his father-in-law tricked him. Jacob types, they like to spend, but when they lock onto something they want, they also exhibit a great amount of discipline to stick with it until they get what they want, and also the restraint to say no to other things until they get whatever they're after. Jacob types are also willing to create and be drawn to beautiful things and experiences. Later on in Jacob's life, he would have most of his children with Leah, but a couple of them would come from Rachel. And one in particular was Jacob's favorite, his son Joseph. And what did Jacob do for Joseph? He used his resources, his money, to make Joseph a coat of many colors. That would have been rather expensive back in those days. Now, we can debate the parental wisdom in showing that kind of favoritism to one of your many children, but it shows you how Jacob related to his money. He was attracted to beautiful things, and he had the desire to create beautiful things as well. It's one of the ways it appears that Jacob liked to show his love. Closely connected to that is another characteristic of a Jacob type, which is the fact that their emotions tend to drive their purchases. Jacob types become so enamored with the beauty of something or some experience, they allow their emotions to push them into expending their resources. Sometimes they might show the discipline of an Isaac, but other times their taste for beauty may make them impulsive. And so, like with all these money types, there is a shadow side. There are some things you have to be mindful of if you tend to be more like a Jacob when it comes to money. And the overarching concept you have to be careful of with a Jacob type is the tendency to overindulge. I don't believe in drinking alcohol, but there's a saying they use in the world that says you have champagne taste on a beer budget. You get what that means? You have a flair and a taste for the beautiful and oftentimes expensive things of life, but if you don't have the budget or the means to acquire or experience all that, then you can really find yourself in some trouble. So a Jacob type, if they're not careful, they may fall into the trap of trying to overspend just in an effort to create appearances. If you have a taste for the fine things of life, then chances are you might find yourself around other people who do as well. And when you get a bunch of Jacob types together, there might be the temptation to try to keep up with the Joneses. So-and-so just bought the newest and latest and greatest whatever, so I got to make sure I show up to work next week with an even better version. So-and-so hosted a party for our friends last month, so I got to make sure that next month when I host a get-together that it's that much better. So-and-so did this for their kid when they turned 16, so we got to make sure that we one-up them when our kid turns 16. That's the kind of stuff that Jacob types have to be careful about, the overindulgence to create appearances. Another part of this is Jacob types may know how to live life at full throttle, but still feel very empty inside. In other words, when you're the kind of person that loves to seek after and find the beauty in life, that's great. But if you think that you will ever find fulfillment by having nice things or by experiencing the best that this world can offer, then you are, listen to me, you are asking money to do for you what only God can do for you and bringing you fulfillment. You may not even be doing or pursuing something sinful. You may find the beauty in things that are not sinful, but if you're looking for or expecting the next big purchase or the next big experience to bring you fulfillment, then you are bound to wind up disappointed. There are a lot of very rich, well-off, very famous people who have reached the pinnacles of their profession and who have the opportunity to experience anything and everything they want to, because for them money is no object. But yet some of those same people have publicly stated that when you get to the top, once you're there, it's pretty lonely and empty up there. A number of years ago, Tom Brady, starting quarterback for the New England Patriots, multiple Super Bowl winner, rich beyond imagination, married to a supermodel for a wife, at the peak of his professional career. He did an interview at 60 Minutes when he essentially says, how can I have all of this success where most people would say this is it, you have finally arrived? And he said, and why do I feel like there's something more? Why do I feel like there's got to be more out there than this? I don't know what Tom Brady's spiritual life is like, and I certainly don't know which of the 7 money types he would identify with the most. But what he acknowledges by making a statement like that is the fact that you can have the very best this world can offer and still be looking for more. And a Jacob-type person needs to be careful at that. They know how to live life at full throttle. But if their priorities aren't right, they're trying to do that to fill a void that only God can fill. Stuff and experiences will never fill your void. There's nothing wrong with stuff. There's nothing wrong with great experiences. You've got to keep it in proper perspective. Do not ask something, someone, or some experience to do for you what only God can do for you. Colossians chapter 2 says, we are complete in Him. Someone doesn't make me a complete person. Something doesn't make me a complete person. Some experience doesn't bring me the kind of fulfillment that only God can provide. Jacob types have to be careful like that. Don't make your life about stuff and experiences, because even if they're not sinful, they will never fulfill you the way that God can fulfill you. So some of the considerations that a Jacob type should be mindful of are, number 1, embrace your desire for beauty. You're the kind of person that's probably going to bring a lot more color to life, and that's a good thing. You believe in high quality, and you believe in having good experiences, not just accumulating stuff, and those are good things. But in that process, don't make beauty all about you. Be others-minded. Don't be self-indulgent all the time. Instead, look to see how you can use your passion for the best things in life to be a blessing to other people around you. Also, like we said, don't look for your fulfillment in anything other than God. Money by itself isn't bad, but when you ask it or expect it to fulfill you, you have to be careful that you don't make money or things or experiences that you obtain. You have to be careful you don't make those things your God and bow down to the altar of that stuff. And lastly, make plans for moments to come. I feel like this is something that could be said for all money types because it's so necessary and so true. But if you know that you're a Jacob type, if you know that you're the kind of person that likes the finer things in life and enjoys great experiences and big moments, then from a pragmatic and very practical point of view, you better plan and budget accordingly. You need to make sure that you have some impulse control, that you're not just signing your name on every dotted line that will give you a shiny new toy or an exotic vacation with no regard as to whether or not you can actually afford those things. If you go in for an oil change, come out with the same car in an oil change. Don't come out with a new car unless you can afford it. But you got so caught up in something that's shiny and new and your emotions got all into it and you saw it was beautiful and you just tacked on 3 more years to your note. Because for a person who likes experiences and moments the way a Jacob type normally does, you're going to want to make sure that you have planned appropriately when it comes time for you to experience and enjoy some big moments in your future. Like maybe a wedding or buying a home or planning for retirement. Planning ahead is the key. So Jacob types are defined by beauty. Okay, let's look at the next one on the list tonight, and that is Joseph. Joseph, of course, of the Old Testament. His money type is characterized by connection. This is an interesting one. One of the most famous scenes in Joseph's life comes as he is at one of the worst places in his life, an Egyptian prison. He's there, of course, on the false accusation that he tried to take advantage of his boss's wife. And while there, he met two other men who were thrown in prison, both having previously worked for Pharaoh. So one night when those two other men had a dream that troubled them, it was Joseph that was successfully able to interpret the dream. For one man, the dream unfortunately foretold his death. For the other man, it foretold of the restoration of his old job. Years later, Pharaoh has a dream that nobody can interpret. And then his butler, one of the guys who was in prison with Joseph, remembered that he knew a guy in jail who could interpret his dream. So he tells Pharaoh about it. They bring Joseph in, and Pharaoh tells Joseph what he dreamt. Had to do with 7 healthy cows being eaten by 7 unhealthy, ugly cows, and 7 ears of grain being swallowed by 7 unhealthy ears of grain, and it was all very weird. But God gave Joseph the meaning of the dream, and the dreams were one and the same. God was showing Pharaoh what he was going to do, that there would be 7 years of plenty in the land, followed up by 7 years of famine. So in Genesis 41, Joseph tells Pharaoh, and starting in verse 33, "Now therefore let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take up the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years. And let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine." Joseph told Pharaoh, "Your dream is the 7 ugly cows and the 7 ugly ears of grain are 7 years of famine that are going to follow the 7 healthy cows and 7 healthy ears of grain that represent 7 years of plenty." And he said, "You're going to be so plenteous in those 7 years of increase that you're going to want to take 20%, a fifth of everything that you gather, and just set it aside and save it, so that when the 7 years of famine strike the land, you'll have food for your people during that time." Pharaoh was so impressed with Joseph that he told him, "You are absolutely right, and that is exactly what we are going to do, and you, sir, are going to be the person that's in charge of this project." So in a moment, Joseph went from being a nobody in prison to a somebody, second in command in Egypt, with the responsibility of overseeing this massive savings project. They would essentially be putting that 20% of their harvest during the years of plenty so they could prepare for the years of famine. And the Bible says that in the years of plenty, they gathered so much grain and harvest that they just stopped counting it. It was too numerous for them to keep track of. But when the harvest was over, and the 7 years of famine struck, it was just as bad as Joseph said it was going to be. And it wasn't just bad for Egypt, but it was bad for the countries surrounding Egypt as well. But because of the savings program that God told Joseph to implement when times were good, the Bible says, Genesis 41:57, all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands. People from other countries were coming to Egypt, and to Joseph specifically, to buy food, because Egypt was the only place that had any. And that's where the idea of connections comes into play with Joseph. As Brown says in the book, I quote, "Joseph connected and executed the will of God, the God of heaven, with the practical economies of the earth below. His connections opened the door for him to be at the right place at the right time with the right perspective." Joseph is about connections. So people that have a Joseph money type, they tend to have a basic belief that money should be used to open doors and make connections. Brown says that Joseph types, they see the relatedness in all things. They form connections between ideas and products and processes and relationships. They view money as a tool to build bridges between seemingly unrelated parts, creating a cohesive whole where one entity is connected to and draws strength and opportunity from another. He says Joseph types view money as a means to open doors of opportunity for themselves and for others. And the thing with Joseph types is that they're really good with money and they're good with how to handle it. If you think about it, before Joseph got into prison, he was managing Potiphar's household and all of his resources, and he was good at it. Then when they threw him in prison, again under false accusations, he wound up becoming a leader in his prison cell. He knew how to make connections with people. He was just good at it. And then when it came to running this massive nationwide project in Egypt, he was good at that as well. Joseph types, they're good with making connections. They're good with handling money. Another core characteristic for a Joseph type is that they view access to resources as a sacred trust. Potiphar trusted Joseph with everything he had in his household, and Joseph took that seriously. Joseph types may be the kind of people that are in positions where they have to manage other people's resources. Maybe it's part of their jobs, or maybe they keep the books at church or at another organization they help support or work at or volunteer at, or maybe it's something as simple as just watching over somebody's home when they're on vacation or something like that. No matter what it is, they take stuff like that seriously because they know that those resources are not theirs. Joseph types have good administrative skills. These are the kind of people that can streamline financial systems, and they find better ways of doing things. Joseph didn't just spit out the idea of how Egypt was going to save all this food. He also created the system by which they would do it, and then he was tasked with the responsibility of making sure it got done. Folks, stuff like that doesn't just happen. We have a hard enough time keeping track of our dollars and cents. This dude had to keep track of the grain in the entire nation of Egypt and find a way to create the processes and means necessary that will store the 20% and keep it tucked away, and then create the system by which to disseminate all that grain in an appropriate manner without creating chaos and upheaval during the 7 years of famine. The stuff like that doesn't just happen. There's administrative work that's not fancy and it's not sexy and nobody really thinks that's cool, but if you don't got it, you got pandemonium on your hands. You ever see video clips of when some part of the world gets struck by some natural disaster and America or some other nation comes with aid and the people are just like, it's like, flies to a light, and if there's no organization there, it's just chaos and pandemonium. If you're dealing with times of crisis, if you don't have the administrative skills, you can have all the resources in the world, but it becomes wasteful if you can't get it out to the people who need it in an organized manner. And Joseph was tasked with that. He was good at that stuff. You don't read about that stuff in the scriptures, but it's just logical sense that it makes that he had to be good at that stuff. Joseph types believe that when they can help others, it helps them to succeed as well. Joseph helped Potiphar. Joseph helped his fellow inmates. Joseph helped Pharaoh, and because of his work, Joseph was helping other nations not starve to death. And in doing all of that, unbeknownst to him, he was also helping himself get reunited with the family and the father that he thought he had lost so many years prior. So Joseph types might also be dreamers. They think ahead. They look into the future. They have a picture and a dream in their mind of what the future might hold and where they think they'll be in that future. As a child, Joseph saw into the future about a day when his brothers and his parents would bow down to him. A Joseph type, they don't live in the moment. They're not as prone to be caught up in the moment, maybe like a Jacob type might be. They're not as impulsive, caught up in the beauty of something. A Joseph type always has an eye towards tomorrow and what they might have to do now to prepare for that. Joseph types are probably pretty good savers. When they get $1 in their hand, their first inclination isn't to automatically see what they can spend it on. It's to see how they can divvy that up and see how productive they can make that and how much of it they can put away for tomorrow. Those are all good things. But for as good as all that may be, the shadow side of Joseph is that if they're not careful, their propensity to make connections can lead to manipulation. For Joseph, we see this when his own family came to Egypt during that famine to get food. They had no idea that they were dealing with was the Joseph, their brother, that they left in a ditch so many years prior, but Joseph knew exactly who they were, and he concealed it for a time. On one occasion, he intentionally and deceptively put the money that they spent on grain back into their sacks, making it look like they stole the grain from Egypt. The second time, he put a silver cup in Benjamin's bag, making it look like Benjamin was trying to steal from Egypt as well. Now, in both instances, Joseph wasn't doing that for evil or nefarious reasons. He was just trying to get his family to come back to Egypt. So I'm not trying to say that Joseph was guilty of any sin in what he did. I'm just saying that Joseph used his power, his influence, and the access he had to resources in order to manipulate the situation. And while Joseph may not have meant it for anything bad, it's not hard to see that other people who have the same money type as Joseph, you can see if left unchecked, there could be plenty of opportunities for someone to try to use manipulation in ways that is not good at all. So this might be the kind of person who likes to use their connections to manipulate. If a Joseph type is a person that knows how to make a lot of good connections, they know how to build relationships and network with other people, these might be the kind of people who like to drop names in an effort to impress and get what they want. The Joseph type might also be the kind of person that's giving to boasting if they're not careful. We see this early on in Joseph's life when the Lord gives him dreams about his future, dreams that one day he would be in a position where his family would bow down to him. And what does Joseph do with those dreams? He just goes and starts blabbing it out to his brothers. Brothers who already don't like him because their father treats Joseph like the favorite. Brothers who are already jealous of his coat of many colors, a gift from his father to his favorite son. Joseph goes and he adds fuel to their jealousy fire by suggesting that they will one day be in a position where they're bowing down to him. Now, Joseph was a young man when that happened, so perhaps you can chalk some of that up to just youthful ignorance, but even still, you can see that in a Joseph-type personality, boasting and bragging can create problems. For adults, it's those people who've seemed to master the art of what Brown calls humble bragging. It's kind of an oxymoron. Those people who like to talk about all their accomplishments, but they do it in such a way to where it seems like they're not being boastful, but they kind of are. And for a Joseph type, it's fine. It's a fine line for them because they're so good at making connections with other people. Sometimes they have to talk about what they've accomplished in order to make some of those connections. But again, if left unchecked, you can become the kind of person who becomes very used to trying to impress others. And then you have to deal with arrogance and pride and just a simple fact that other people will, over time, quite frankly, just get sick and tired of listening to you talk about how great you are at whatever the latest, greatest achievement you may have. So given all of that, here's a couple things for a Joseph type to consider. Number one, tell the truth. When a person knows how to socialize and make connections with other people, there's a tendency, if you're not careful, to exaggerate the truth when you're trying to brag a little bit on yourself. It's the guy who goes out fishing and he has a successful outing. He caught some really great fish. But every time he tells the story to his friend, the size of the fish he caught just gets a little bit bigger. You know, like, dude, I heard you tell that same exact story last week, and that fish grew 18 inches in 7 days. How's that happen? You know? If you're a Joseph type, be truthful. Secondly, be connected internally. Joseph types are very good at connecting with others. But there are some people who always seem like they're very good at being the life of the party. They're sociable, they're funny, they can make friends with a rock and sell ice to an Eskimo. They're just those kind of people. But sometimes those can be the same kind of people who are tore up on the inside. And you never know it because they're always the life of the party. They're really good at connecting with everybody else, but they may not be really good at connecting with themselves and with God. Sometimes they're the life of that party. You know why? Because parties come with a lot of commotion and noise. And perhaps one of the reasons why they're so good in that environment is because they want to keep the party going for as long as possible. Because once the party stops and the noise stops and the crowd goes away and dies down, then they have to be alone with their own thoughts. And they don't like that. You have to work on being just as good with connecting with God and allowing Him to work on you as you are with connecting with other people. You have to guard yourself against always trying to impress others all the time and focus more on how you can impress God. And then lastly, and this one of course comes with a grain of salt, but you got to share your dreams selectively. If God gives you something, a dream, a vision for the future, whatever, you're not required to go take an ad out in the paper and tell the whole world about it. I understand we overcome by the power of our testimony and all that stuff. There's that aspect of things. I get that. But there are some things that God may give you that are just meant for you. I don't mean like special revelation where you're special and you have truth that nobody else. That's not what I'm talking about. But there might be some convictions that God gives you that are just for you. There might be some things some dream that God gives you for your life in the future. Just, you don't have to go blab it all around the whole world. There's something, the Bible talks about Mary. When she was interacting with Jesus, there's some things she just kept to herself. It's okay to keep some things to yourself. When it comes to finances, not everybody wants to hear all the time about your next great idea or about how much money you made on such and such a project. Most people, quite frankly, they don't care. And it doesn't come off very well to others when you're always talking about your financial success. Having said that, though, there's something else that Brown writes in the book that I thought was very insightful. He talks about if you are dealing with a Joseph-type person, maybe you're married to a Joseph-type person, maybe you are closely connected with these types of people in your life. He says, and I quote, going along those same lines of, being selective with who you tell your dreams to and not bragging, all that stuff. He says, it's also important for those that are close to Joseph types to listen with grace. That is, to believe the best. Boasting, he says, may be in the ear of the beholder. And while it sounds like a Joseph type is boasting, he or she may simply be excited and sharing their dreams and aspirations. He says Joseph types may not be able to discern how they are being perceived, and their motives may be innocent. So you got to be careful. You can't shoot somebody down just because you feel like they're coming across in some sort of a bragging type of way, or you feel you want to roll your eyes the next time someone wants to tell you about whatever great achievement or accomplishment they had, financial or otherwise. It could just be that's just how they relate to money. Again, doesn't give them a license to be proud and arrogant and boastful, but as he said, you got to learn to listen with grace. You can't nail somebody for their potential shortcoming or weakness because you have them too. They just may be in a different area, and you want people to treat you with grace as well. So Joseph types are all about connections. So I'm coming to a close tonight, but what I'm hoping you see here, we've covered 4 out of the 7 types. I'm hoping that you can relate to some of these. There may be some that you completely identify with and say, that's me, I'm that. There are other people that may say, I'm a little bit of that, but I've got a little bit of Joseph and maybe a little bit of Isaac, whatever, and that's fine. The goal here, again, is to help us understand how do we relate to money. Because like we said before, we all have, just like we have different personalities and we all interact with life and other people in different ways, and there's no one way that's better than the other, it's the same thing when it comes to how we relate to our resources. There is no one best way of doing it. There are general principles that apply to all types. We talked about those 2 weeks ago. Everybody should learn how to live on a budget and live within their means. Everybody, if you call yourself a child of God, should be a giver and a tithe payer and a giver and offerings and generous, to what you are able to do. Everybody, if you want to be wise, should be a saver. Consider the ant, the wise man said. He stores in the summer to prepare for the winter. Joseph was a saver. He had the wisdom of God, obviously, to say, you know what, it's really, really good for the next 7 years. It's about to get really, really bad. Now, nobody wants to think about famine times in their life, but every single one of us knows they happen. It's a lost job. It's a car that breaks down. It's a medical emergency. It's, the 1 month where every single one of the kids in your child's class has a birthday party, and you got invited to every single one of them, and you got to get a gift for every single one of them. Not really. I'm just using it as an example. There are times where, expenses go up. Some expected, some unexpected. If you are not prepared for that, like Joseph was, then you're going to find yourself like all those other countries around Egypt, looking for someone to help them and praying you find an Egypt somewhere. And that's the point. We believe in a God that's Jehovah Jireh, but we also believe in a God that's given us the wisdom and the sense to know that I don't have to go around like this every time there's some catastrophe my way if I've been wise enough to store up in my harvest to prepare for some winter experience to come. That won't make you run the aisles, but it's going to save your marriage from arguments. It's going to save you unnecessary stress when the time comes, because you've made the discipline to say, you know what, God, the resources you put in my hand, I'm going to manage them well. I'm not just going to spend on everything that's beautiful to me because I'm a Jacob type. I'm not just going to host the most extravagant parties because I'm an Abraham type. I've managed it well, and I'm ready for stuff that may come my way, good or bad. That's the goal, to take big